Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Robert Swarwood here. Thanks for tuning in tonight. Our guest tonight has won the Bram Stoker Award, the British Fantasy Award, the Massachusetts Book Award, and is the author of several novels, including The Pallbearers Club, Survivor Song, The Cabin at the End of the World, Disappearance at Devil's Rock, Head Full of Ghosts, and the crime novels, The Little Sleep, No Sleep Till Wonderland, and the short story collections Growing Things and Other Stories, which I have here, and his most recent, The Beast You Know.
Oh, thank you. Hmm.
Oh, there it is. His essays and short fiction have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Entertainment Weekly, online, and numerous years best anthologies. He has a master's degree in mathematics and lives outside Boston with his family. That's right. It's your favorite writer and mine, Paul Tremblay. Paul, how are you doing tonight?
Good, good. Thank you, Robert. I gotta trim the bio. It's too long.
Trust me, I've seen longer.
Yeah, yeah.
In fact, quite honestly, this was something that we were going to get into, I think, a little bit later. But let's talk about bios, just because I was remembering, like, for anybody, like, so how long have we known each other? It's been, I was trying to think about the other day, at least 2 decades.
Yeah. Because you were at Blood and what was the magazine's name again?
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So Flesh and Blood with
Flesh and
Jack
Blood.
Fisher's
Yeah.
magazine. I
Yeah.
remember, I think I was in high school when I went to my first Nikon. I think that was probably the
Oh,
first time I,
really?
I met you.
Yeah. I met you
Um,
briefly at an econ. Yes.
and that was and at that point you were editing or like one of the editors or readers for, and I never knew, what is it, chizine or what, how do you pronounce it?
I call it cheesing, but it's chizing because it was short for chiaroscuro. So
Yeah.
I guess technically it was cheesing.
So
Uh,
yeah, and
Geez, that might have even been before that. That was probably when I was like reading slush for like Prime Books fantasy magazine because that definitely came first.
Fine
Uh,
Books had a fantasy magazine. I don't remember that. I
yeah,
remember
yeah,
that
it
they
was
have.
actually a hard copy magazine called just Fantasy Magazine.
Okay.
I think they had
Oh,
like five or six
wow.
issues, and then he started doing like anthologies under that name. But so I mean, I wasn't there for the whole run as a fiction editor, just for like maybe two or three issues.
Yeah, so I don't know about you, but I had found that reading Slush was like, that was an education in and of itself.
Absolutely.
And
Uh,
so, I mean, basically, you saw from the other end, like all of these, and again, going back to just bios, like there are times where you would read someone's cover letter, and you can just tell by the cover letter that the story was not going to be worth reading, which sounds awful, but I don't know if you agree with me. Where sometimes
yeah,
just like how the writers kind of like purport themselves, you just
right.
knew that, or, and then plus, my favorite part was you got to a place, I don't know about you could tell by the first page, or sometimes even like the first paragraph, if this
Yeah,
story was going to be, worth reading more.
absolutely. Uh, no, I mean, that was especially at the time when I was doing the slush reading, which was like my first go around was with fantasy, and that was probably like '04, certainly in the mid 2000s. And Shizy's run was a little bit later for me. But, as a relatively new writer, that was a great lesson in it was a great lesson in what not to write. I mean, it's really in a lot of ways harder to learn that lesson. Because, for me, I never studied writing in an academic setting. So it was like I was just reading all these amazing short stories. It's like, oh, I want to try this. I wasn't reading bad short stories. So when I read Slush, it was a totally different experience. Um, I mean, it was also fun to have like these discoveries out of the blue, like, oh my God, like, this is so good. I didn't know, I've never heard of this author before. Now I want to read all their stuff. But so like when I started writing novels, that was also like a trickier thing because again, for novels, it's kind of hard to get that lesson in like reading reading bad novels or what novels don't work. Because I was not reading slush piles for novels. That's certainly for
I
sure.
can't even imagine. Although I
No,
think it's
no,
the
no.
same thing. I mean, you could probably tell by chapter one, or probably the first couple of pages, whether or
I
not
would
the book is going to
imagine,
be
yeah.
worth reading. So actually, let's jump back to the beginning, because, and I was telling you in our green room that I really wanted to, because I've known you so long, I know a lot about your history, because I remember a lot of these books that came out. Like you mentioned, Prime Books. Like I remember your first
Yeah.
collection. Our mutual friend Stuart Onan had written the introduction for it. I'm
Oh,
sure I
yeah.
had a copy. I don't know if I still do, but I had a copy at one point because I remember that. And you had your novella, that, what was it, City Pier, which I like to
City
talk to you a
Pier.
little bit about that.
Sure.
When
Yeah.
I looked on, by the way, did you know the compositions for Young and Old is still available on Amazon?
It is. It's still like available through, I don't even know if it's Prime.
Like,
It's
are you getting royalties off
I
this
do
stuff?
get, yeah, they don't
Okay,
sell that
good.
very many copies, but I do get a royalty check from, I forget the parent publisher
It's
of Prime
Wildside.
at the time. Thank you, Wildside. Yes, I
Yeah.
do get small royalty checks from Wildside periodically.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure you're aware because sometimes you run into
Yeah,
writers who are like, wait, I thought that book was out of print. I didn't know they're still
yeah,
selling it. So, okay. So I was able to do the look inside on Amazon, and it looked like the earliest story in that collection was published in 2001. Does that sound right?
yeah, yeah.
So was it around 2001 when you really got into it? Or, I mean, how long before that had you been writing stories? And then at what point, I guess, even going back a little bit
Mhm.
further, at what point did you realize, hey, you know what? I think I want to do this.
Yeah. So I mean, well, actually, I don't know. I would say like a lot of people. For me, I was very much like started off as a hobby. Like, I didn't start messing around with writing until like I was like what, 23, 24. Is that right? Like around like 1995, I had this weird itch to try writing a story. On the heels of math graduate school and falling in love with reading at the same time, which is sort of like a weird double thing. But yeah, for most of the mid 90s, I was just writing almost for kicks, but I was sending it out and I was, trying the highest markets first and getting all the rejects. Um, but in the early 2000s, I started making sales, and some of them are small, like, $25, $10, but I always made sure I got paid something. Um, I think, geez, in 2000, I might have sold my first story for like 3 cents a word. And that was definitely like a big deal.
Yeah, back
Um,
then that was quote unquote pro rates.
right.
The
Yeah,
yeah,
my
three
first pro
cents.
sale. Yeah. Um, I don't know, and that like that certainly spurred me on. And in the mid 90s, I was messing around with writing music, and it became clear, unfortunately, that I was a better writer than musician. So like my creative outlet went more fully towards writing fiction. And I don't know, I just sort of like stuck with it and started selling more short stories and was able to catch the eye of, Sean Wallace at Prime. I'm very thankful for. Like he gave me a lot of opportunities as a young writer, including the collection you mentioned, compositions for the young and old. Like the first he ended up printing it twice, once in 2004 with an intro from Jeffrey Thomas, but then he wanted to repackage it. I'm not quite sure why we did, but with this time with a intro from Stuart Ornan. So there are two versions. There's only one version for sale
Is it the same stories
currently.
and everything? It was just a different introduction.
There might be a story or two difference. I think, or definitely, there's at least one story that's different in the '05 version than the '04, maybe two, but definitely one. It's been a while. I don't, not 100% sure. Um, yeah, so I don't know. I always, I never dreamed like you mentioned, like when did you think you could just do this? Like for me, like teaching and writing was always tied together. Like I didn't start messing around with writing until I started teaching. So it just seemed natural. It's like, oh, this is what I do. I teach, and then if I get a free hour here and there, I'm gonna mess around with writing. And that's just sort of how it was, even with the novels. But hopefully, I've reached a point where I don't have as much energy as I once had for doing both, and both feel like busier. The writing side definitely busier. I think that's all writers feel that like. This is, I'm sorry, I go on rambles, but this is the last thing I would mention is
No,
I think
absolutely.
for all of us, it's much busier now, not only because of social media, but just what, 4 years ago, there was no Zoom, there was no Zoom panels, there was no like very little Facebook Lives. Like if you did an event, it was in person. Maybe you did that a couple of times a year. But now it's if you're fortunate, you get asked to do either a podcast or like Zooms like this, all throughout the year. Which is great. I'm glad people are interested, but I do find it definitely sucks up what used to be the writing time. When I'm
Yeah.
working, when it's during the school year. But anyway,
Well, we can get into actually, yeah. Let's talk about that now. I mean, I don't think it's any secret that you have a full time job as a math teacher. When do you find the time to work? I mean, or the time to write? Do you set aside times at night, or like do you get up super early in the morning? Is it on your lunch break at school? I mean, do you have certain set times, or is it just when you? I mean, how do you juggle that? I mean, plus having a family, you have a kid, and
yeah.
and everything else.
So am I in like the in the 2000s when I first started getting serious? For me, it was like an amazing lesson in time management. Um, where it would be like, hey, if I had 45 minutes free period, I would use it, or a period that I didn't need for teaching. Or if the kids were taking a quiz, I'd be using it. Or, especially when my kids were younger, if they were napping, that's when I would write, or I would get up earlier on the weekends. Like there was no set time. Um, but that ended up being like a really important thing for me to get used to because I couldn't afford like, I need a writing ritual. I have to get in the mindset. It's like, no, I have to just sit down and write if I have the time. I'd say now though, if my kids are older, and actually, one's in college, one's home from college. I'm pretty much at night at these points. Sometimes at school, if I know like I have a big block where I might get to use it, but social media sometimes ends up taking up that block. I'm trying to do that less. Um, yeah,
So do
I
you,
kind of wish I was better. Like I used to be way better at the just sitting down and jumping in. And now the distractions make it a little bit harder, but shit's
yeah.
still getting done somehow. I don't know.
So do you typically try to, especially I guess when you're working on a novel, get a certain like a word count, page count, like on every session, or is it just kind of like, again, we'll go back to our mutual friend Stuart, a
Yeah.
man, I don't know if he's still doing it. Actually, I'm going to be talking with him, I think in 2 weeks.
Oh, nice.
I'm going to ask him if he still does. I think for him, it was just like, he just wanted to write like a page a day,
Yeah.
which I mean, it's interesting. I couldn't do it. Like it's like for me, it's like I want to write at least a chapter or something. Like just do a page and then set it aside
Mm,
and then come back to it. It just feels very daunting in a way.
yeah. Well, I know like how Stewart writes though. Like if you've ever read The Art of Fiction by John Gardner, um, the last part of it, which is sort of beyond me, like Gardner gets into the actual rhythm and types of rhythms, like of the language, of the syllables. And I know Stewart gets that sort of granular with his sentences. So to me, it sort of makes sense. Like, oh yeah, Stewart is writing a page and it's probably this perfect, or ends up being like this perfect thing. Um, so for me, I usually aim for 500 words. Like when I sit down, like that's the goal. If I hit that, I feel awesome. But going in with the knowledge that it's okay if I don't make it, I try to be somewhat forgiving and realistic. If it's a novel, so at 500 words a day, then like, well, I'm probably going to miss a day or two. So realistically, if I can get like 2,500 a week, and then like for the month, like, well, stuff happens. If I can get 10 to 12,000 that month, that's great words. Um, and what I find is at the beginning of the novel, it's a lot slower than, maybe you experience the same thing. Like when I'm toward the end, I definitely feel like I've built momentum and things are picking up speed. And I sort of know what it is at that point. Because I edit as I go as well. So like whatever I wrote the day before, and if it's a novel, I usually go not only back to the day before, but I'll start like at a section break or even the chapter start there. So like my 500 words tend to be sort of like bare bones, and then I go back and I just kind of like slowly fill it. And sometimes it feels like, man, I'm never going to get there because I'm just adding to what I had. But each day, if you just go a little bit more forward, eventually, I find my way to the end.
So do you find yourself, I always hate using the term, but I always do because everyone knows it. Like, is it more of a plotter, a pantser, or is it kind of a hybrid? I mean, like, especially, I guess with short stories, obviously it's different, but when you're
Yeah.
working on the novels, which more than likely you probably had to, give a proposal to your publisher. I don't know how detailed those are, but I mean, do you sit down and at least kind of have maybe the end in mind, or are there times where you're like, this is the starting point, we'll see what happens?
I almost always, even without a proposal or a outline, know the beginning and I know the end, or I know like a vague shadowy version of the end. Um, and for me, it's always how do I get from point A to point Z. Um, when I first worked on novels, I wrote outlines most of the time, and that was to help me because I felt least confident in plot. Like, so I wanted to try to figure out, like, have this map of, okay, here's a map of essentially the plot. If things change, that's fine. And I would find for most of my outlines that things in the beginning would sort of follow the outline pretty closely, and then it would deviate quite a bit. But with the recent books, I haven't really done an outline. I don't know if that means I'm getting lazier or not, but I keep a lot of notes as I go. Like, so with my new book that's coming out in June, horror movie, I never sat down and did an outline, but I think I kind of wrote one as I went. Like I would work on a chapter and then like look ahead, try to map out some of it, and I would go back and write. So by the end, I had like this really messy notebook that is sort of like an outline, but I didn't write it first. I don't know. Like, I mean, how many novels are you up to, Robert? I mean, you're probably, geez,
Well, keep in mind, I do more, commercial pulp thriller
yeah,
type
but
stuff as opposed to, I feel like yours is much more literary. And like you said, like for me, when I'm at least in the last couple of years, I try to do kind of the Nora Roberts vomit draft, at least for the first draft. Like I just am
yeah,
like
I wish I could
running
do that.
nonstop where I can just get it
Yeah.
out. And the same thing with you. Like I don't really like we had sold something to Audible Original last year. And then like, I had to outline it, and it was going to be
Mhm.
like a 30,000 word novella. We said it will probably be this. But then when we sold it and I got down and started writing it, I realized to make this work, I'm gonna have to do all this other stuff. And it became like
Mhm.
60,000 words. So, you know what I mean? So that's why I hate
It's a
to
long
outline, just
novella.
because it's one of those
Yeah.
things. In fact, even a project right now, we kind of have a very loose outline, and I've already started just diverting, because like
Mm,
I love when just the story and the characters just kind of like go their own way, and
right.
just you as the author are not. I mean, like, do you feel like in control sometimes when you're writing, especially a novel, or are there times where you feel like just no, the characters are really taking over, or some other type of part of it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel control, but when I say I feel like it's more like the mysterious, weird subconscious, that brings me ideas, that brings us ideas. When I get stuck, I kind of look for that weird part of your brain to speak up and help. And for me, it's usually like if I'm in the shower or if I take a walk or something, or usually like the moment I walk away from the desk and I'm not thinking about the book, like a solution will come up or an idea will come up. Um,
Well,
yeah, so
do you do you do you like mow your lawn? And the only reason I say that is because I
yeah.
found sometimes now, because usually wherever I go, if I'm in the car, I'm probably listening to a podcast or audiobook. If I'm at the grocery store, podcast or audiobook, it feels like the only time where I am not, have some type of media in it is when I'm
Mm,
mowing. And that's usually where I can let my mind kind of go and kind of
yeah.
be like, and there have been times where like I'll figure something out if I get stuck. I'll just go mow, or I'll be somewhere where I'm like not around my phone or anything. And I
Yeah.
can just kind of let my mind go and be like, okay, there we go.
I do. I try to foist it onto my son most of the time. If he's home, he'll mow, but every once in a while I will. But I used to mow all the time. But no, I agree. Uh, any of those kind of moments are great. And I should be more mindful about not filling those moments. Like, I take a lot of dog walks, filling those moments with like music well, actually music is good because
Yeah,
I'll
absolutely.
drift off. But like filling it with an audiobook to try to squeeze in another book or sports radio, my vice. I listen to a lot of local sports radio. Um, I just oddly remember like again, very first starting out writing, I think everyone has, I think it's good to dream. You allow yourself to dream. And I maybe published a short story or two. Oh, my first story that I sold, I remember mowing the lawn. And the first story that I sold was called King Bee to a Delirium Books anthology. Do you
Oh
remember
yeah.
Delirium Books?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I remember mowing the lawn, like imagining, oh, wouldn't it be great if that won like the Stoker for short story? And imagining, I was imagining at the time Poppy Z. Bright, obviously Billy Martin, there, like, I don't know, like presenting the award. It was such like an embarrassing, fun
It's good to have
daydream, but like,
dreams.
everyone has the
Absolutely.
daydream. Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's probably scary if someone doesn't have any like input, any
Right.
ambitions or daydreams or anything like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm looking at my notes here, and we had jumped right into it because I forgot. I have literally I have written out first and most important question: when and why did you drop the G? And for OG fans, you'll know
Yeah.
that Paul's byline for the longest time was Paul G. Tremblay, and at
Paul
some
G.
point,
Tremblay.
um, it disappeared. I mean, was that? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like,
Yeah. I know when it disappeared. I used it initially, no pun intended. So my father is Paul N. Tremblay, so I definitely was
mm,
like, no, I don't want, like, not that I was worried, not that he's published books. Uh, uh, Although we did reject a short story of his at Fantasy Magazine, another story for another time. Um, Yeah, so that's sort of why I think I used it initially. It was like, okay, not a junior, different first or different middle initial, or with my dad. And then was with the sale of the first novel, Little Sleep. They're like, do we need the G? I'm like, I guess not. So sort of from that point forward, just sort of dropped it.
It kind of makes me think about how T.C. Boyle, with his novels on the, like, you know, at least on the covers, it's T.C.
Yeah.
Boyle, but when he like publishes a short story in the New Yorker or whatever, it's T, whatever that is, Boyle.
Yeah,
I've
T.
never seen.
Caragasian,
Yeah,
something like
it's
that. Yeah.
whatever. All right, yeah, I always wondered. I thought it was more of a, you know, we want to make your name as big as possible on the cover, so we want to try to, you know, get anything out.
No, just pure dad issues.
So, okay, so going back to compositions for the young and the old was your very first collection. That was in Prime Books 2005, which, man, we are coming up on almost 20 years here.
Oh, that's crazy.
Um,
Yeah.
do you remember the very first story that you wrote? And was that a story that you then tried, you know, shopping around, or was it one of those stories where
Mhm.
you wrote it and you're like, okay, you know, back in the drawer with you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, I wrote it. It was the first thing I'd ever written, like in terms of fiction like that, since high school, probably. Not probably, absolutely. And I'd never written anything that long. It was probably like a 4,000 word short story. Um, my aunt, who I briefly lived with after grad school, had bought me a true crime serial killer book for Christmas, as most aunts do. Um, and I had this idea for a serial killer story, like a Piers Anthony serial killer story, where death personified shows up because the serial killer had killed someone he wasn't supposed to. So sort of goofy, but also, uh, yeah, no, I sort of played it straight as well. But anyway, I know I did. I sent it out. Um, I had family, and mostly family, not friends. I didn't have any friends then. A family read that story and offer feedback and stuff. I'm like, all right, Uh, yeah, and then I just sort of moved on to the next one. The other thing I remember with that story is I started writing it on my girlfriend, who's now my wife, her brother word processor. I don't know if you remember those things where it's like the screen was like big enough for like a line, maybe
It was like a
two.
line or two. Yeah, you could do it at a
Yeah.
time, and then
And I wrote 7 pages and I, lost it. Didn't save it, didn't back it up on a hard, yeah, I think it was like a hard disk for those things. And I remember like, oh man, is this a sign? Not that I believed in signs, like to give up, or do I power through and write it again?
well, so what,
So I
but
did.
what
Yeah,
was the thing that, um, I mean, like, who were you reading at the time? Like what, like, authors were the ones that really
sure.
inspired you to be like, oh, you know what, this is something like for me, you know, like I think I was in the sixth grade when like Jurassic Park the movie came out, so I started reading all like the Michael Crichton books, and then in eighth grade, I think it was, I read my very first King book was Insomnia, which,
Yeah.
if you've read Insomnia, it's probably not the best first King novel
Yeah.
you
Wow. And
have.
you kept
But
going.
I remember reading Insomnia and just loving it and being like, oh
Yeah.
wow, this is what I want to do. And so that's when I really started to have that passion. I mean, for you, like, what was the thing where you know, like, yeah, I mean, at what point, or like what authors really just kind of inspired you to really start that?
Um, so I was a math humanities double major in undergrad, and the humanities was just like a hodgepodge of electives. But I ended up taking my last, as a senior, second semester senior, basically a lit 101 class. Um, and I don't know, I had almost like the Dead Poet Society experience with the professor in that class was really cool. He was into punk music, so we bonded over that. In that class, it's funny you mentioned T.C. Boyle earlier. He assigned us a couple of stories, one by T.C. Boyle called Greasy Lake,
Oh
and
yeah.
and another by Joyce Carol Oates. Um, where are you going? Where have you been? And the Carol Oates story, especially, I remember reading it and going, "Oh, I didn't know people wrote things like this." I still remember the paper I wrote talking about those two stories and comparing it to Jane's Addiction song "Ted Just Admit It." Um, I don't know, just like a really angsty puppy kind of paper. But shortly after that, I graduated. Lisa bought me the stand for my 21st birthday, and that was like, whoa. I inhaled that. And then when I went off to grad school for 2 years, which is a much different experience than undergrad, and Lisa and I were doing the long distance relationship thing. That's where I had all this time to read. So I just, burned through all the King, and from Dance Macabre, I went to, and actually probably I went to Straub because of the Talisman, and then found other writers because of Dance Macabre. Um, and Shirley Jackson, stuff like that. So I don't know, like, I don't know if it was like one singular writer. Obviously, I mean, we can credit like Steve King for, for certainly, priming that sort of pump. But with the first story, and it's not too different now. It's just like I knew, like it was just this idea that wouldn't leave me. Like it kept just coming up, just kept coming up. I was like, geez, maybe, I guess I should try something with this. And that's
Yeah,
kind of
that
how I
was
know like what story idea to work on. Like is it'll just I'll find myself thinking about it. And if it sort of does that enough over a long enough period of time, it's like, okay, I guess that's the one I should be working on.
right. And that was something that I wanted to bring up because I think you mentioned it in your in the story notes in this collection. Because I think I kind of do the same thing too. Like if I have an idea, I do you write down the ideas? I guess if maybe you're pitching it to your agent or whatever else, they're written down. But do you
Yeah,
like when you have ideas, do you write them down anywhere? Because at least for me, I
I do.
typically just don't write them down because I feel like if it's an idea that just keeps coming back to me, it's an idea
Yeah,
that's worth having. And their ideas are probably like over like a decade. You know what I mean? That just I don't have the time to do it, but like I'd love to do at some point. And the
yeah.
fact that they haven't gone away, I feel like it's probably worth it. But like, yes, it's the same way for you, where it's just these ideas. Yeah, do you just kind of keep them in your head, or do you have like a notebook or like a Word doc somewhere of just story ideas?
Yeah, I definitely keep notebooks. I used to not write that stuff down, but I'm finding, I forget stuff more often. Like, oh, what the hell is that idea? Usually it's sort of related to like something involving the story. So I try to get into the act of writing more things down. Um, Eventually it became like a fun thing, like, because I have a whole bunch of notebooks. Like I bought this one in Spain. It's a Bosch painting, which is really cool. So for me, like, oh, having the notebook, it's like a little way of like priming the pump. Oh, okay, maybe some interesting ideas can go in here or something. Um, but yeah, like you said, there'll be things that even if I don't write them down, I'll just or I might jot something down briefly, but there are things that I'll jot down and then like, I'm not thinking about them as much. And other things I'll jot down and I'll, you know, like similar to what you just said, they'll just keep coming back and resurfacing.
So with City Pier, I want to talk about City Pier very briefly
CDP, yeah.
because we're already like halfway through. I don't want to spend too much time,
Yeah.
but I remember for a while because again, I remember reading a lot of your stuff, back again in that early because we had kind of come up together in a way, like
Yeah.
I was published around the same time you were publishing these short stories in these like small press magazines.
Yep.
Although I remember you had that story in Razor magazine, and that was such a huge
Oh,
deal because
yeah.
that thing paid you had like $1,000 or more, right? I remember
Something
you
like
had
that.
said,
Yeah.
this is how
Yeah.
good
So
my
like
memory is. You had said that you used that to go buy like I think you got to get like a new washer or dryer or something.
yeah. Wow. Almost forgot about that. Yeah. Razor is like the Canadian Maxim or something
Yeah.
like that. Uh, how did that come up? Like, I think a
So
friend of
I
mine
think
said,
I
"Hey,
want to
so,
say Nick Mamatas somehow managed to get a story in there,
yeah,
and
there's
then
a
all of a
brief period where
sudden
the
everyone's
editor was
like,
like,
"Wait, we can,"
yeah,
like, "Oh, you mean that you can submit stories that are not just giving you 2 cents a word?"
yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, that had to have been it. Like yeah, I subbed and like wasn't, and they were like, okay, great. So it must have been an editor who was open to like weird quasi horror stuff for a brief period of time at this glossy Razor magazine. Wow, I totally forgot about that. That was a great feeling. Uh, I forget what the question is now.
I don't remember what the question was either,
Yeah,
but yeah, with City Pier, I mean, so for a while it seemed like your stories that you were setting a lot of these stories, these City Pier stories. I mean, was
yeah.
that I don't know. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but like, was that a thing where you kind of had this idea to create this whole almost like a China Mayaville type world of whatever, and then you just kind of maybe like stopped, or I mean, or were all the stories that you did kind of that's it?
Yeah, so I mean, so that was yeah. So I think most of those stories were probably written between like '02 to like '04, '05. Um, and definitely a fan and continue to be a fan of China's work. But I think City Pier was actually more directly influenced by Jeffrey Thomas and his Punktown stories, which I just adore and still do. Um, and I was gonna say, like at that point in my writing, like I was always like, oh, I want to try what they're doing, but I still do that now. So I shouldn't imply that I've left that phase. Like, um, but yeah, I was like, oh, this is really cool what Jeff's doing. And I had this idea of this sort of out of town city that was built upon like this giant, hundreds of feet tall wooden pier. And below the pier, that's where the sort of technocratic city would send like the homeless to eke out. And that was sort of like the setting. But then I had these, four stories, and then, I had a weird novel called Swallowing a Donkey's Eye that's set in the same sort of in the same universe. Um, yeah, I know that they were fun to write. Definitely. If I were to go back and read it now, I'd probably like read like who is this person who wrote this? Um, but they were a lot of fun, and thank you, Jeffrey Thomas, for the inspiration on those.
So, and then let me see here. So, okay, I'm going to talk about your first two novels real quick, just because for me, I had started out, like you, reading a lot of horror. I wanted to be a
Mhm.
horror writer, and then at some point, I kind of realized, you know what, my passion's more in the crime, mystery, thriller type vein, and
Yeah,
I don't really write any of that stuff anymore. For you, you were writing all these like horror short stories, science fiction, and then your first novel was essentially a crime novel.
yeah,
And, you know what I mean? And then it was just like this like sudden, a sudden like 90-degree turn or
yeah.
whatever, however they call it. I mean, what was that? Because and again, my memory for this is almost stalkerish. I remember you talking about, like, if I remember correctly, you because you've been with your agent Steven since I mean, you've never had any other agent, correct? Or no,
Correct.
you did
Yeah.
have another agent, but that didn't really, you know what I mean? Like, if I remember correctly, there was a guy who kind
I
of
never really
screwed you
officially,
over.
yeah, I
Yeah,
never
you
really
were with
officially
him.
signed with the guy.
But
He
then
sent
when
to
you were
one
with
editor, but
Steven,
yeah.
but well, no, I guess you got the little sleep. Did Steven sign you on because of the little sleep, or was it from something
No,
else that you had done?
yeah, I was with another novel. So I signed with Steven in '06 with this other novel called Phobia, which was just sort of like a weird screwball comedy in Boston about a character who had the fear of the inability to complete simple tasks and others like strange fears. Um, yeah, so it's funny, like my first attempts at novels were all sort of darkly comedic. I mean, some of that maybe you can blame my love of Kurt Vonnegut. But, certainly at the time, like I was just reading all the Kurt Vonnegut novels I could, and Chuck Palahniuk as well. Um, I don't know, like up really honestly up until A Head Full of Ghosts, like every time I tried to write something long, it was more satirical, hopefully funny. Like Swallowing a Donkey's Eye sort of fits there too. I mean, it sort of makes sense because horror and humor are like, two sides of the same coin. Yeah. So like for the crime part of it, I'd read some, but I wouldn't say I was like obsessed with crime. It was more just general cultural knowledge that like everybody has about crime fiction. So for that book, he did a lot more, the research I did was reading like all the Chandler that I hadn't read. I mean, I'd read some, but not all of it, and reading some of the other sort of classic noir novels. I remember being somewhat, I want to say obnoxious, but I think I was more afraid because it's like, here's Paul Tremblay, crime writer. Like, who's that guy? I remember I had said in some interviews that, like, oh, I wrote this with a horror attitude, whatever that means. I don't know.
Just imagine if those books had taken off and you were working on, like, book 15 of the, what was it, Mark, I forget the name right now.
Yeah, Mark Genovich. Yeah,
There would be a whole, but I mean, unfortunately, but I guess in a way, fortunately, they didn't do that well. So you
yeah.
kind of had to go in a different direction. And actually, let's go down here because I want to talk about the Harlequin and the Train, because this
Yeah.
was the first time that I really noticed your experimental side.
Mm,
Because, and again, it's been a very, I mean, it's been like 20 years, and I think
yeah,
I remember reading your first collection, but if I, so I don't remember the story, exactly, but
yeah,
if
yeah,
I remember correctly, they were pretty traditional, at least in the way that most of the stories are told traditionally, right?
yeah,
Like, when you look at like your recent collection, I mean, there are some things in here I would say that are, I don't want to say experimental, but things that are
yeah.
not like just a very traditional narrative.
Right. No, I agree.
So I feel like Harlequin and the Train was that first time where I'm being like, okay, Paul's really doing some new stuff here. And for people who are not aware, this came out in 2009. It was limited to 400 copies.
Mm,
Blah blah blah. It says expands upon the short story of the same name, published in the collection. It's an experimental fiction narrative that requires you to interact with it using a simple yellow highlighter.
yeah.
So, like, how did this? I mean, was this the very first like experimental thing that you had done? And if so, like, just where did that come out? Like where'd that idea come from?
Yeah, it's some of the timelines messed up. I mean, certainly at that length, I think it's, probably some point in between compositions for the young and old and before that novella version of Harlequin on the Train, I was doing or trying some experimental stuff with the shorter fiction, but Blame House Leaves, I guess. I must have, I can't remember which year I read House of Leaves, but that, I adore that book. Um, yeah, so I mean, part of it was I had the short story, which I wrote for, John Edward Lawson's Cannibal anthology. I can't remember the name of it, but that's why I wrote it. Um, and then I have a local friend, Chris Meyer, who's a producer. He's done some work with the Fairley Brothers, and he's done his own stuff. But the time I was like, oh, you should try writing a screenplay. So I took the Harlequin Train. I wrote this really weird screenplay that didn't work, but I liked a lot of the stuff that I added. So I'm like, oh, maybe I'll I'll just take the screenplay now and write like the novella version of the screenplay. And it just got really weird. Um, the idea of the highlighter is like, somewhat pretentious probably, but like, to further implicate the reader to make you highlight these things. There was no like secret message. I think Paul Miller asked me once, oh, what's the secret message when you highlight everything? I'm like, there is none. uh,
Or
but
is
that
there?
novella, yeah, but that novella can be had for free uh, through Concord Free Press, but it's under the name Another Way to Fall. Um, so it's Harlequin on the Train with a novella by Brian Evanson. And Concord Free Press, if I can give them a plug, an amazing publishing company. Whatever books they publish 3,000 copies, hard copies, and then give them away for free. And the idea is if you get a copy, and it says so on the book, if you get a copy, you're supposed to donate to the charity of your choice, however little or how much you want, and then you're supposed to pass the book on to the next person to raise money. Yeah, so I mean, I know they've raised in the millions with a bunch of the books that they've done, and it was really cool. Like when they first did this, when did we first do this? It might have been 17 or 18. Uh, to see the people, to see the donations that this weird little collection of novellas ended up raising.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Um, and then obviously you've really kind of just expanded that idea of the experimental with your most recent Pallbearers Club, which I have the hardcover here.
Thank
Um,
you.
which I know kind of created a little bit of a fuss with the Kindle edition when it first came out, just because if you
It was
it feels like
unreadable.
when you're writing this stuff, you kind of don't think about like, I guess a good chunk
I
of stuff
try
people are
to.
just now reading on their things
Yeah.
and how the publisher is going to be able to handle that. But we're spending a lot of time here for people who have been tuning in. Thank you for tuning in. If you have questions you want to put for Paul, if we have time, put it in the chat. We'll see if we can get to it as well. So I want to go to, so you did a couple other short story collections. You did In the Meantime
Mhm.
with Shizine, and then was that the only one I think? And then before you had Growing Things,
Yeah, that was the
correct?
last one before Growing
So the
Things. Yeah.
thing about you, which I've always been impressed about, is the fact that you have a major publisher doing short story collections. Because nowadays, I mean, yeah, you'll have like George Saunders, you'll have King,
Yeah.
you'll have a few things here and there, Kelly Link, but for the most part, publishers seem to be backing away from short story collections. And
Yeah.
so far, you've done now too. So was that a thing where the publisher was on board with it, or I mean, like, how did this one come about?
Yeah. I mean, so I was thinking exactly the way you were thinking. My first deal with Morrow was A Head Full of Ghosts and Disappearance at Devil's Rock. And so when I wanted to pitch for the next deal, I wrote like this absurd 30-page proposal for a novel that I did not write. I sent that proposal in with a proposal for Growing Things because I was like, hey, there's a few stories that would connect to A Head Full of Ghosts. Um, and when my editor came back, she was like, I like the collection idea, but I don't like the novel. And I was actually kind of relieved that she didn't like the novel proposal because obviously there was some part of me was like, I don't know if this is the one. And so then, I luckily came up with The Cabinet at the End of the World not too long after that. Um, but yeah, no, I was, to me, it was just like it felt like a feather in the cap that, hey, here's this, big, quote unquote, big publisher that's going to publish a short story collection. I mean, the advance for it
Yeah.
was, much, much, much smaller, which at the time was like, whatever, like they're publishing a short story collection and I'll earn out the advance. Um, and then when it came time for the next book deal, I didn't pitch which was, we pitched in the Pallbearers Club. She said, okay, we want this book, another novel, another collection. I'm like, you want another collection? I don't know if I have
Wow.
enough stories.
Very nice.
Yeah. It's like, okay. And I end up writing the weird animal novella for Beast You Are,
Yeah.
which was an
Well, we're
idea
going to
that
talk
had been
about
kicking
that.
around. Yeah.
Yeah.
And even recently, like I can't like it's officially say anything. Unofficially, like we've just gone through the whole like book deal thing again, and they said, "How about another collection?" I'm like, "Really? Okay."
I
So
mean,
maybe like in
that's
four
clearly
years
that the
there'll be one
numbers
more.
are, the
Yeah,
numbers are strong enough that they want to keep doing it. Because I mean, you got to figure like, people like us, we like short story collections. The general public,
yeah, no, even
they
my
couldn't care
family
less.
included.
Yeah.
I was still on the phone with
So
my mom before we got on. I was like, I don't think everyone in the family's read that book.
So with this, with the very first one, especially with one that wasn't going to be like, a short, essentially, the in the meantime was just like a small press
Yeah,
collection, probably a limited run. This was going to have probably a decent, probably not as big as a print run as your like novels,
no,
but
definitely
that
not.
still it was going to be a bigger print run than any of your other collections.
Yeah.
Did you basically just take the stories and put them in, or did you like revise the stories? I mean, like, like, or like, how did you go about that?
Um, there were really no, I should say no, there were pretty much no revisions or, just very light. Like if it was syntax, grammatical stuff, I kind of wanted to
Right.
leave the stories the way they are, with the exception of actually growing things. I changed the sisters' names to Mary and Marjorie, because the weird life of that story is the growing things appeared in the meantime, and the sisters' names were different. But when I was writing A Head Full of Ghosts, it was like, oh, these sisters tell each other stories. What's the story that they would tell each other? And I thought about the growing things stories, like, oh, I'm going to have one of them tell the growing things story. I was like, why not? I wrote it. I can use it. It ended up being like a theme of A Head Full of Ghosts, so it really worked out. So it's kind of fun to then like go to this collection, which is going to be read by more people. That's all I changed was the sisters' names to make it sort of like retrofit A Head Full of Ghosts. And I think there was only one original story to Growing Things, but it was a long one. It was a novelette.
And then so to the beast you are, because so I've had growing things. And I don't know about you. I mean, I have so many books. Like you can probably see
Oh
there's a whole
yeah,
pile of books here. Like in my office, it's my wife hates it.
yeah,
Um, so like
same.
I've had this one, like a lot of your books, like I haven't had a chance to get to that one yet because but we were going to
That's all
talk
right.
about this.
Well, thank you.
I really
Yeah,
got into this. In fact, I didn't finish the novella at the end. I got about like probably like 50 pages. But for the most part, I got the rest of the stuff done in like the
yeah,
last week because I've been juggling like two other projects right now.
sure.
But I was surprised to see that the blog at the end of the world was in this collection because that's such an
Yeah.
old story. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Where I was like, I almost would have thought it would have been in this collection. So I guess my question going back to this is how did you decide, you know what I mean? Because you had so many stories.
Yeah,
What
yeah,
was that process like where you were like, you know what I mean? Like, was it
yeah.
just an ongoing theme? Or
Mm.
like, how did you decide this story and this story, but not this story? Even though this story is probably really good, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. Uh, well, yeah. I mean, without like, I don't know, I don't want to make too quantitative or quality decision, but like with growing things, like I'm only gonna take in my head, I was like, I do want to take a couple of what I think are my best stories from In the Meantime and put those in, and they just sort of they felt like to me that they'd fit in that book. Uh, and similar with The Beast You Are. I mean, The Beast You Are to me sort of has like monstrousness as a theme, whether it's actual beasts or monsters or people, behaving that way. But also like in the post slash during COVID world, uh, I thought it would be kind of interesting to have the blog at the end of the world sort of in that book. Um, because, it is about like bloggers' reaction to a maybe, some sort of maybe epidemic. Um, I don't know. It seemed like okay, that'd be kind of interesting to have like as a part of this book, more than 10 plus years later.
So, yeah, in terms of blog, again, my memory for some of your stuff is ridiculous because I remember that won
I
the
appreciate it.
one of the Chizine contests,
It did, yeah.
and they actually created a website
They
for
did,
the
yeah.
story. Is that still a way? I mean, is
No,
that
that
is still?
I think it was only live for like a year or two, but it was really cool because that way you could click
Yeah,
and
you could actually, it was interactive where you
yeah,
could, it was an actual blog set up. And for anybody who hasn't read the story yet, it's essentially somebody's blog, and probably half the story is just like comments to
right.
the posts or whatever else. And
Mhm.
so the actual website, it was really neat. Was that Brett had done that, right? I mean, or like who
Yeah.
had kind of come up with that?
I it was it was probably his idea, but I loved it. I mean, it was fun like choosing avatars for the different commenters, all of that stuff. It was a really cool, thing that they did for that story.
And of course, reading it after we went through a pandemic, it's like, wow, okay. it takes
Yeah.
on a whole, different scope of things.
Yeah.
Um, before we get into other stuff, I do see we do have some questions here in the chat. From Maria Elaine says, which story of yours, if any, was the one that you were hesitant to explore and later share with the world? Horror attitude, I imagine, takes a bit of a deep dive into a
Yeah.
different mindset. Was there anything that made you think, maybe that's a bit too scary?
Um, well, there was one story in Compositions for the Young and Old that I wrote from the point of view of a Susan Smith kind of character. So I say kind of character, a mother who had like drowned like her children. Um, especially when I wrote that at the time, that was, I don't know, a sort of a difficult, icky place to go, given, that my kids were still that age. But, part of it was just to try to not sympathize, but empathize or want to understand, like, how that could happen. Um, yeah, I don't know if I would write that story now, but at the same time, I'm not ashamed that I wrote it at the time I wrote it. I think that was like an important thing for me to mess around with. Um, I don't know if something's, it can go one of two ways. If something's really upsetting to me, like sometimes it really draws me to it. But there are things also that like that I won't that I won't go near. Some of them are I don't know, like I can't write about like nuclear war and stuff like that just because such an that was such a fear of mine as a teen in the 80s. I tend to avoid even anything like media related to that because it upsets me so much.
So some of your stuff has dealt with the pandemic. Now that we've actually, we've all experienced the
Yeah.
pandemic, do you feel that that's something that you would not want to return to?
And certain, no, I wouldn't write it in the way like Survivor Song, which I wrote right before. I wouldn't write Survivor Song after we'd all been through the pandemic. Again, so I'm glad I wrote that book when I did. Um, but I have a book that I wasn't anticipating was going to be set in the not in the first year of the pandemic, but in the first year after it hit. Um, a short novel that's actually going to be that's a middle grade novel. Without ever saying the words COVID, but there's references to students doing hybrid learning and stuff like that. And I had no idea that was going to be the case. Like I had a central, the creepy image to the story. But when I dug into the why of the character, why he was so lonely, it made sense to me to have him placed in this sort of, that isolating time that we all experienced. And it became a way for me to sort of honor those students and also honor like us teachers. Like, I taught, you know, my school went back full in person September 2020. I think we were one of the first schools, just that first year, especially of teaching in masks and sometimes being spaced out and having the hallways go in one direction, one way to try to like stop the flow, like all these things that we did. Um, so I did find that I didn't want to go back, but like, I mean, subconsciously, I must have wanted to go back just to sort of like honor sort of that thing that we went through. Like, but I wouldn't describe it as like, oh, I definitely wanted to write a story about that. I was like excited about that aspect of it. I wasn't. It just sort of happened.
Right. All right, let's see here. What else we have? We have Reggie um Reggie Lutz says, if you were going to collaborate on something new, or you could pick from your team, or you could pick your team from anyone living or dead, who would it be?
Oh, I don't know. I would pick Friends most likely, just because I feel like I know we could handle the give and take. I've co-written a short young adult novel 10 years ago with Stephen Graham Jones. That was a lot of fun. The only hard part for me was that he writes so damn I felt like the turtle to his hair. Um, John Langan and I used to throw around an idea. I was like, oh, maybe someday we'll co-write something. That would be fun. But it's hard. Everyone just gets so busy. Um, and like I'm very fortunate to have like contractual deals and deadlines that like I stress out about. So it's kind of hard to take on something like that at this point.
And Justin Gower says that he'd love to say Paul and Ronald Malfi work together in some way. They are the best out there right now.
Well, thank you. I appreciate
So
that.
that's nice. I'm sure Ronald would love to hear
But
that too.
but we're all mad at Ronald because he can't actually play music too. So
All right. So we
I
do
mean,
have a
I
few
can
other
play,
questions.
but I can't write.
So
I
we do have
can't
a few
play
other
very well.
questions
Sure.
in the chat, but before we do, yeah, I want to talk about the novella here, the title story to the collection. Um, your publisher has been very supportive of you. Obviously, they keep wanting short story collections.
Yeah.
What did they say when you're like, I want to put in this this novella that's just all a prose poem?
This was a don't ask permission, ask forgiveness situation. Because when she said we want another short story collection, I'm like, oh, I'd had this idea for the anthropomorphic animal novel in free verse for a long time. But it's like it's one of the few, well, I should say one of the few times, but it was definitely one of the times like, oh, there's no way they would let me do this. There's no room in the marketplace for this kind of thing. So I just kept like pushing it aside. But once, she said, hey, we want a collection. I'm like, oh, I have probably enough for like half of a collection. I could write one or two more. And I was like, oh, wait, I could write this animal thing as a novella and have like this big, let that be the big original chunk to the collection. So yeah, I didn't tell my editor Jen that I was doing that. I just sort of did it. Um, and to her credit, she wasn't like, what the hell is this? She was more like, what the hell is this? Man, I gotta say, it's not, not to say that it's great or anything, but it was definitely the most fun I've ever had writing. I usually don't describe writing as fun, but I had I had what I like to describe layered barren moments because my friend Laird talks about like he's often writing and cackling at what he's doing. Um, I was laughing like a couple times writing that novella. Like, I can't believe I'm doing this.
So was that one too where you knew? Because I remember reading in the story notes again. I haven't finished the action novella yet,
That's
but I
right.
did read the story notes where you had
Yeah.
talked about a lot of these different pieces were in your head. Did you know how it was going to end? I mean, did you have a good idea of like the size of the length? I mean, I guess that's another question too. Like when you have a novel idea, do you have a good idea? Okay, this is probably going to be 80,000 words, or this is probably
Yeah.
going to be closer to 100,000 words, or are there times where just you get really surprised when you go past whatever benchmark you had
Yeah.
set for yourself?
I don't know if it's weirdly like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but like I'm oddly good at like, I think this is going to be about X amount of words, and it ends up being almost exactly that. I have no idea how or why. Like I might have overshot the word count a couple times, maybe Disappearance of Devil's Rock, because that was probably the book I was least confident in where like the ending to me was like by far the blurriest. I didn't know where it was going. So that word count just became its own thing. And Pallbearers I knew was, well, actually I think that ended up where I thought it was going to be. So yeah, once I said, okay, I'm going to write like a 30,000 word novella, and it ended up being 30,000 words. I don't know. It's weird.
So, and then obviously you do give the shout out in the back
Yeah.
of the book to this book, which is Sharp Teeth
Sharp
by Toby
teeth.
Barlow. Which I had to think about it. I think the reason I found out about this book, I think that you were raving about it, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it might have been like right when we first started the Shirley Jackson Awards too. It might have been a nominee. And I mean, I think that's how I read it as a juror for the Jackson Awards, I think. But oh man, it's so good.
It
Um,
is. He's never done anything else, has he?
he has a second novel that I have not read, but he
But
does. He
probably
has
written,
something
but
that
it's
was
not the
published
same though,
after.
right?
I don't think it is. No.
Yeah. That's tough when you like out of the gate have a debut like this. And
Yeah.
then because people are probably like, always expecting kind of the same thing. And then it's.
Yeah. For those who haven't read it, it's
Yeah,
Los
pick it up.
Angeles werewolves in free verse. But again, it's not confusing in the least because
No, it is. It's
yeah,
amazing. In fact, I've been meaning to go back and reread it.
it's a lot of fun. Yeah.
So when you were doing the free verse, I mean, did it just become natural to you, like where you were doing the breaks, or did you find yourself maybe at times like what was that process like in the actual composition of it?
that one I really focused on like the rhythm, like either in my head or reading it out loud as where a break would come. Um, so I think again, like I went really slow in the beginning, and once I said, okay, once I got to the feel, I was like, okay, I think this is the feel or this is the sound of the language that I want it to have. Um, I just sort of tried to stay consistent with it or stick with it. Um, yeah, so again, even though I said it was a fun thing to write, it doesn't mean that like it happened super fast. Yeah, I definitely wasn't going along at a 500 word clip a day with that one for sure.
So we are getting close to 8 o'clock. I mean, you've been very generous with your time. I don't want to spend or take up too much of your time, but a few more questions.
Sure.
One thing
Yeah.
I am really curious about was with A Head Full of Ghosts. Um, what was what was the process like to getting the permission from Bad Religion for the lyrics? Because I've always heard that that can
Yeah.
be a nightmare.
I've heard that too. And so for, and I've been successful ever since A Head Full of Ghosts of getting lyrics permission from bands for every book since then. Um, so I get to indulge sort of the music fan in me. So honestly, with them, I forget who gave me Brett Gurowitz's email, but I got his email and just said, "Hey, I'm writing this book where it's written. Can I, you know, ask permission, for the, for this lyric?" And he was like, "Oh, that's so cool." He started like because the song was about metacognition, I think I made the book sound like it was about that or something. I don't know. But no, they very graciously offered permission, and I just have this boilerplate contract that HarperCollins makes me use. I'd much prefer just like a handshake or something. But I've had good luck, and also like, I'm not writing Elton John or Taylor Swift. I'm writing bands who are, I hate to say smaller but to me they're bigger. But bands who aren't like filling the stadiums. My favorite bands are ones that I go see in clubs, kind of thing.
Right. So they're not being like, sure, no problem. It'll be $20,000.
Yeah, no, the only time that came up was I wanted to quote something from a Clarice Lispector book that had just been retranslated. So it was like a small academic press, and they wanted like $600. I was like, no, like, because I knew my publisher wouldn't pay for it. I'm like, I felt bad because the translator went to bat for me. She was very upset. She's like, I don't see why they wouldn't just, give you permission for it. But yeah, so that hasn't happened with musicians, just the literary presses.
A few other questions here in the chat, but
Yeah.
my last question for you is if you could go back, like, obviously as a writer, I think it's the same for most writers. I think some writers probably do plateau, but a lot of writers, they're still always constantly learning, constantly growing, constantly, refining their craft. If you could go back 20 years, what's like the one thing you would want to tell your, young Paul G. Tremblay? Is it like, focusing more on, pacing, on, just character development, you know what I mean? Like the setting. I mean, like, is there any like one type of thing that you would want to, like you really kind of learned and wished you had known earlier? Or maybe it's not even just the writing process. Maybe it's just about just the business in general in terms of just,
Mm,
publishing.
yeah. I mean, because I mean, the writing thing, like, I don't know how much I've learned. Like, I mean, I think I hate to hesitate to speak for you, but we feel like we learned something. And that can be a little bit of a frustration too, because it's like, wow, look at all the stuff that I know, and maybe something new doesn't hit like something old had hit. But I guess, certainly for the for the Paul who had just dropped his G for the little sleep before going into his, how am I talking about myself in the third person? Uh, with Henry Holt. But like the idea that like, hey, a big publisher just bought your book, especially as a new first time author, like all your problems, quote unquote, are solved. Meaning like, oh, like you got it made. They're going to do everything for you. It's like, no, you still have to do most everything yourself, and you have to really advocate for yourself. So I wish I knew that at a younger age, because I probably would have spent like, because after those two, Little Sleep did okay, but the second book was dead on arrival. Then I spent like 2 or 3 years just feeling bitter and angry. And I
Yeah.
could have saved, maybe I could have cut that in half, maybe if I had realized, oh, like, yeah, I still have to do my own promotion and
Yeah.
check up on check up on these guys.
No, and I think that's really important for especially young writers to know that they should really build up that bitterness and resentment toward publishers at the beginning, because otherwise, you're going to be surprised when
Can I
you
tell you one
actually
more
kind of
thing?
start dealing with it.
Yeah, I'm gonna tell you one, that a debut novelist, and I won't say who she is in case she doesn't necessarily want this out there because she said this in conversation, not like in front of other people. But her first novel just came out and it's really wonderful. She had worked in publishing prior, so she had a little bit of a leg up in knowing like what to expect. But she said to me it was just really simple, but I think important and powerful. Is like, she's like, I wish more writers knew that they could say no, like
Mm,
to your agent or or your editor slash publisher if they ask you to take something out that you really don't think should be taking out, or ask you to change the title or ask you to do this or that. Like you can say no. Um, I think that's almost impossible for new writers. It's still almost impossible for us too, because
yeah.
like you're like, oh, if I say no, they're not going to publish it, or they're not going to put any muscle behind it. They're not going to put anything behind it. But I think that's good advice. Like, just make sure that you're right. Like, it makes the book better, or the way you have it is a better book as opposed to what you're saying no. See, she said already said it much clearer than I just muddied it, but I wish the younger me knew that too.
Some quick questions here.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Yes, we are going to talk about horror movie. We'll save that for the very end because that's coming out in a couple months. John O'Harris asks, any chance you can get to Canada if there is a tour for the upcoming book, please? Niagara Falls specifically.
I would love to. I've never been to Toronto. I would love to go to Toronto. Yeah, I'm not sure. I will say, I think I'm going to have somewhat of a tour this summer. So fingers crossed. We'll see where I end up.
Very cool. Justin Gower also wants to know how you permanently look like you're 27. So
Oh,
personally, I think you look more like 32, but that's just me. Um,
I, Justin, you said was his name, their name?
yeah, Justin Gower, if
My
I'm
favorite
pronouncing that
person in the
correctly.
world right now. Thank you. Oh my God. Now I've been feeling like really old looking lately with the gray beard, and my wife bought me with like some like lotion because I never put lotion on my face. And my wife's been doing it for years and she has not a wrinkle on her face. I'm like, oh man, I should have been doing that. So now I'm like trying to retroactively lotion away some of the crow's feet and stuff. And I don't think it's gonna work.
Yeah, I've learned in the past year. So my wife has taught me about the retinol and
Yeah.
moisturizer and stuff for the longest time. Never had any interest. Justin also asks, what book aside from your own are you most excited about to get your hands on in 2024?
Oh wow. Well, I'm gonna humble brag a little bit. This just came in the mail today. The Arc of Stephen Graham Jones, the Angel of Indian Lake, his the third book in his slasher trilogy. Um, Man, what else is coming out this summer that my mind is blanking because I usually get to read. I'm lucky that I get to read a whole bunch of stuff that comes out first. Mariana Enriquez is another book coming out eventually. I think another collection, so I'd be really excited for that.
I
Um,
did download that based on your recommendation.
yeah. Now I need to start looking at the books that are coming out. I've been sort of lost and I'm gearing up to start another novel. So I've been like doing some reading research and sort of mood reading. I don't know if you ever do that, Robert, where like my next book might have a little bit more humor to it. So I've been trying to read some things sort of in that vein
Do
to
you
try to
find
before I start working on the book itself.
Yeah, do you find yourself kind of like jumping back into this, but do you find yourself at times if you're working on a certain type of book that you don't want to read maybe certain authors because you worry, like at least I find like I don't want to like find myself copying their voice or style.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like I try to want to
It's
stay
for
away from that.
yeah. Most of the time I don't. Most of the time I sort of lean into that because that's how I learned how to write. I feel like was just by like, oh, that's really cool. I kind of want to do something like that. And the hope is that, you can take a spark from that book and make it sort of different or make it your own or put your own voice to it. That said, like Survivor Song, I avoided like zombie stuff for whatever reason, but Head Full of Ghosts, I leaned into reading all the Exorcist stuff. And with the Pallbearers Club, I reread a bunch of my favorite, what I lovingly call first person asshole narrator novels.
Mhm.
which is sort of like one of my favorite kind of genres of book, because that's what the Pallbearers Club is hopefully going to be. So yeah, I'd say more times than not, I actually sort of, I don't know, I sort of welcome those intrusions because I feel like sometimes they help. Seeing someone better doing something I want to do, it helps me fix mistakes that I might have made already in the draft or something like that.
Very nice. All right, last question here. Just what can you tell us about a horror movie to for everybody watching here? I know people are really excited about it. It comes
Yeah.
out in when's the pub date again?
June 11th.
June 11th.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, so that's I mean that's gonna be here before we even know it. So
I
yeah, so
know. Yeah.
what can I mean actually, and I think you just posted on social you get yeah you have the arc there. I mean, so what yeah, what can you tell us about it?
So, I'm so bad at the elevator pitch or the description. Anyway, so this book, um, it's actually, well, I won't say that part. So anyway, in the 1993, these 20 something year olds made sort of an art house, disturbing, pretentious horror movie. My favorite kind of horror movie. In the Rhode Island area. They filmed pretty much the whole movie, but it never made it to screen because something happened on set. And now, 30 years later, one of the few remaining people who worked on that movie um, is in on sort of the reboot or the attempted reboot of the movie, which was called Horror Movie. Um, and so the book is mainly from this character who in the movie is called the Thin Kid. It's from his point of view. I mean, he's really sort of narrating the story, except for the times where it cuts to, I'm laughing because of the experimentation that we talked about, where it cuts to the screenplay of the original movie. So I pretty much include, not pretty much, I include the original screenplay of this movie that was made in 1993. So it bounces back and forth between the screenplay, him reminiscing about what was going on set, to him sort of present day. There are some fun, hopefully fun scenes at a convention that's very much like Scares That Cares. um, there's him having conversations with producers and stuff. So it's sort of like a mix of disturbing, making a horror movie, mind fuck slash Hollywood tell all. That was
So
a
did
big word stew. Sorry.
Well, no, yeah. So to get into just the nuts and bolts with the screenplay aspect, did you like were you using like Final Draft or like how were you doing that like, when you were drafting it on your end?
So I do have Final Draft because I have tried messing around with screenplays, but for this book, I did it all in Word. Um, I wanted it to feel like, obviously, I mean, in 1993, whoever's writing the screenplay was using a typewriter or a Brother word processor or something. So to
Yeah.
me, like formatting it myself, I felt like
Mm.
felt somewhat authentic to maybe the time period
Yeah.
in some way.
So since you did mention you do have Final Draft and stuff, like what stuff have you worked on? Was it more trying to like you were trying to adapt stuff of your own, or have you tried to like doing some original things?
Trying to adapt something of my own. I took my short story 19 Snapshots to Dennisport and wrote a screenplay for it. It's fine. Probably not the story to start with because it ended up being sort of an experimental screenplay, which I don't think people necessarily want, certainly not the studios. Um, Geez, yeah, otherwise not too much. I've done more writing like a 20-25 minute pitch with a couple other filmmakers. We've been trying to pitch a couple stories here and there, but I don't know. We'll see. Things have been optioned, but most of them are kind of far away from ever making it.
Yeah.
But I'll take the option for sure.
Oh, absolutely. As they say, option money is free money.
Yeah.
So the latest book is The Beast You Know by Paul Tremblay. The new book coming out in June is Horror Movie. Let me see here. We had one last question.
Yeah.
Will we see some signed copies floating around shortly after release? Yeah, like is your publisher, because as I know that some of the publishers do that thing for like the indie bookstores where you'll find like the signed copies. Like, are you going to be doing any of those types of things where maybe some of the indie stores will have signed copies or?
Yeah. So the short answer is yes, there will be some signed copies. I'm just not sure where and when yet. Like in my town, I do a thing with Mad Mama's Vintage. And you can still go to Pam's website, which is Mad Mama's Vintage, and she has most of my books and I sign and personalize through her. But
Oh,
we're gonna
perfect.
hold but we're gonna hold off on horror movie for a little bit, partly because, and again, like I can't really say officially, unofficially, uh, there might be like an extra, an edition of the book with extras, for a certain for a certain market. And I may sign a bunch of those first, kind of thing. So I don't know. The short answer is yes, there will be. I'm just not sure when and where yet.
Awesome. Well, Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to hang
Yeah,
out, and
thank
thank
you,
you for
Robert.
everybody for stopping in and watching us, blabber on for the past hour or so. So,
Yeah. And Justin,
uh,
thank you.
and so everybody, Paul, online, you're at what, paultremblay.net, correct?
Yes.
And then social media, you're on all the sites, Instagram, Twitter. I refuse to call it the other name. Facebook,
Yeah,
obviously.
Twitter.
Blue Sky. Is there some other crazy
Yeah,
social media website that you're
I
on too?
no, I don't do threads. It's funny, like Blue Sky, I thought it was Blue Ski the first time I read it because I'm stupid. But I was gonna say the G lives on in my handles for Twitter and Instagram because both of
Yes.
those are Paul G. Tremblay because the
Yes.
French Paul Tremblays already have all the Twitter handles, the French Canadian bastards that they are.
So everybody go check out Paul's books. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Rob.